Hi, everyone. Welcome. So, I think maybe we can start by considering this question, the role of art and culture for justice.
So when we had this conversation, we said that, as a historian, I would kind of start out framing some of this. Mm-hmm. And so what I think is crucial about this nexus of citizenship and racial narratives is to understand that there isn't as much of a dichotomy between those two things as we suspect. And the reason I say that is this. The project that I'm working on now is the book about Charleston and the 9 people who were killed in the basement of Emmanuel AME Church in 2015. And as a result of that, people are very familiar with the very dramatic turn of events that involved the removal of the Confederate flag. This is what the then Governor Nikki Haley said would happen as a consequence of this. And the flag comes down. Of course, Bree Newsom had removed it on her own before, and I preferred her method of removing the flag. But it comes down officially. And it isn't until a few days later when I'm there, I'm still in town, and I'm talking to a local historian who pointed out something that I would not have noticed, and indeed most people there would not have noticed, which is the statue of George Washington that sits in front of the State House in South Carolina, in Columbia. And it's not uncommon for there to be a statue of George Washington in front of a State House. And he asked me if I knew what this meant, and I was like, it's statue of George Washington. And he said, no, do you understand that the statue of George Washington was there in tandem with the Confederate flag? And then as a historian, the gears kicked in and remembered that the people who seceded from the Union, the people who sought to destroy the Union in 1861, did so in the full pursuit of their belief that they, not the federal government, not Abraham Lincoln, they, those 11 states, were the true heirs to the spirit of 1776. Which is to say that their conception of citizenship was one that did not include black people. And they made this argument with some justification. They looked at the 1790 Immigration Act that said that the only individuals who would be allowed to immigrate into the country and become citizens would be white men. That when we look at 1857 and the Dred Scott decision, we fix upon that phrase which says that no Negro has any rights that a white man is bound to respect. But what we don't recognize is that Chief Justice Taney is writing in his estimation of the founders. He's not giving his own opinion. He's saying, as far as I understand the framers of this Constitution, they never intended for the Negro to be part of this compact of democracy. And so when we look at what happens in the establishment of the 14th Amendment, and we look at what happens consequently in the struggles that go from the 1860s to the 1960s to realize this century-long series of promises, and that culminates in the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act and the things that are under siege now in 2019, what we have to recognize is that this is not a matter of citizenship and racial narratives. It is a matter of our concept of citizenship being a racial narrative. And so I think that is what's so crucial about the work that we're talking about here. These interventions, which are literally saying the 400th anniversary of our time here in this country, and in the colonies that preceded it, that this is who we are. We have been witness to everything that has happened here. We have been an engine to how all of this has evolved, and that we have been this insistent presence saying that for those who said that all men are created equal, all human rights are endowed by our Creator, that we indeed are human. And this has been the testament that I think is so crucial to the visual aspect of what we're here to discuss.
Right.
Thank you.
Maybe we can, I think that one of the things you're talking about is racial discourse in the public sphere, and I think that that's something that's really important to, Alex, your work. Maybe we can look at it now. Yeah.
I think everything's about race. Black communities, gay communities, immigrant communities feel a lot of media representations to be inadequate, biased. There's a lot of reporting around police violence and Black men. And I realized a lot of the arguments that we were having were about depictions. I started to wonder, how different would it be if I swapped images or if I changed some of the text? And so that was the first time I physically started playing around with the works. This isn't a grammar exercise. I'm really trying to see if I can disrupt subliminal messaging about who should be valued. I needed kind of one of the most respected institutions that kind of prides itself on getting this right to kind of say, actually, nope, you're not getting it right, right? The counter-narrative series, the primary way you see it is in public, in the streets. We went to 4 locations between Bedside and Crown Heights area and hung them up. You imagine who might be moving in at like the height of gentrification in many of these neighborhoods. And you're putting this print up of this like dead Black kid. The title is 2 Lives at the Crossroads, equating these 2 lives as if they're neighbors. The Times layout to me perpetuated that. The subtlety there is that this isn't equal. These people are on equal footing. They have equal responsibility in this event that took place, and that's not true. I don't believe that. You have a cop and you have a kid, and there's a responsibility here, and it lies with one person more than the other. I know he was 18. I feel like if he wasn't Black, we would be calling him a kid. So there's a lot of what in journalism is key information. He'd sometimes use drugs and he'd rapped, and I just don't think that that's necessary information. So I blacked it out. Like, oh, that's what you do when you're 18. You do drugs and you drink and you rap and you curse. Cause like, really, did you just write in here that you cursed? It just goes to show how important images are. It changed the way I viewed the text. Now you know he's a kid, right? During the Olympics and the Ryan Lochte scandal, you have this headline about these swimmers, and then there's this big photo of Usain Bolt. And I remember just being like, what the hell? There's no way if the track team had done that, they wouldn't have been on the front page. People felt like I caught the Times making a mistake. And maybe willfully using an image of a Black man under crime. I found a very good image of Ryan Lochte that was just him alone in the pool. I redacted most of the article, but I also inserted white Americans into the title to categorize it in a way that other races were categorized. I guess there's something restorative about it, kind of restorative justice. You know, online, the hashtag was like white crime, white photo. And that was really funny because people were like, yeah, that's actually a really good hashtag.
When you are done with the fans, move back. Move back. When you are
I'm 35, I've never seen a torch rally. Like, this is some shit I feel like I would read about in a book. It was a riot by white nationalists, and I was like, they're gonna get it wrong. And they got it so wrong. It was a side piece. It had 2 columns out of the 5 on the front page that day. If you have a white torch rally, this is a major event. This isn't a sidebar item. For the most part, I keep the layouts how they are. But the problem here was the layout, right? That's the journalistic hiccup here, is that this layout doesn't speak to the severity of these issues. what you give space to and what you allow people to see says a lot. The Tulsa hate crime is a really interesting one because I didn't really make an image swap. Vernon Majors was this white guy. He lives next to this Lebanese family, and he had harassed them for years. And eventually, and unfortunately, he kills the son, Khalid Jabara. It runs with this wonky headline that says he's a Tulsa man and accused of harassing this Lebanese family, charged with murder. That's interesting. The Lebanese family had been there for 30-something odd years. I'd say since '83. And this guy had been there like 7 years. And so I'm trying to figure out why he would get that title. If anybody was to get it, it's Jabara who should get that title. And I removed Lebanese. And I also inserted white American. I was really interested in the way the news can slightly other people. And I used the word racism as well. Because he called the family dirty Arabs, but then it just says harassing. And I'm like, I don't understand why we can't just say racism. Like, they just didn't want to use the word racism. The news cycle moves so quickly that we're all kind of skimming through things and we're just kind of accepting narratives. It's not always this bombastic and in your face. There are these subtle ways that racism works in the oldest of institutions. If it's not this egregious thing coming at you, I think it's so easy to ingest. You might not print Mexicans or rapists. What other ways do you contribute to the thinking about minorities? You have to be able to look in the mirror and go, we're failing in these ways. And if you don't see yourself as maybe just as much of a problem in some ways as Trump, then what work are you doing? What's important about counter-narratives is that it's not meant to be like an indictment of news media. I could almost say that it's just as much as an indictment of the reader. Now, I don't know what impact that will have with the papers, but I definitely know people are saying to me, when I'm reading now, I'm saying to myself, why is this photo here? There's something about seeing a different image, about shifting the size of a photo. It gets at a feeling that people have, but they don't know how to explain it. Where I'm situated as a person in the margins, I think I can see where there are gaps in ways that other people may not. I'm a Black gay woman. That goes very much into kind of how I see the news, how I interpret what happens, what I believe might be an angle that's overlooked. Doesn't necessarily mean I'm more right. It just means I have a different vantage point. So there are a few more works in the series, and I'll quickly get to them here. I guess it's a little weird to sit and watch myself, but I'm a lot more long-winded than that video, and we're short on time. So the counter-narrative series is something that I maybe first thought of in this really odd way as a journalism student in 2013. Sitting in a classroom full of mostly white people trying to figure out why the news felt like it was giving me the facts, but it wasn't true. Like it wasn't honest. Something felt amiss. And over time, particularly in 2016 when there were a number of police shootings and we're all just ingesting a variety of media, one of the things that really became clear to me is that media is kind of white supremacy's number one way of importing particular views and things that we have about ourselves and others. And so it started in many ways as a selfish project. I was trying to block out a lot of the kind of noise and the violence that comes through in these very subtle ways. And by the time, 3 years after grad school, I figured it out, this article layout always stuck with me. So I went back to it. And when I first started doing them, I was putting them out at 2 a.m. illegally in Brooklyn. This is somewhere in Bed-Stuy. And so I was kind of watching on social media anonymously as it kind of took off. I'm sharing this smaller here is because there was a pivotal moment where I realized how invested we are as a public in particular narratives as well. This band came through, I guess a sign of gentrification, and covered the work up with this sign, right? And someone peeled it off. Now, you know how hard it is to peel something that's sticky off of something else, right? So I have this visual of someone just kind of hovering over it, breathing, and then kind of slightly peeling back. And so I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting, but the wall is pretty messy anyway, right? And so it's doomed to come down. And then it gets painted, but that gets left. So then I realized at that moment the importance, particularly of this image. Now, the journalist side of me was like, damn, the first panel's gone, they don't get it. But the other part of me realized that this was something redemptive for people. And so I'm just gonna quickly slide through the other ones. This is an install that I did at University of Kansas. The goal of the larger aspects, larger pieces of the work is for people to kind of gather around and to dialogue about some of these topics. And in many ways, I think they're really perfect for college campuses in those ways. This is also University of Kansas. This is just another quick run through of the works that you saw. This is a newer one. If you look at on the left-hand side, this is when Venus Williams was going to be one of the oldest women to reach the finals of Wimbledon. Prime tennis time. At the bottom, maybe right-hand side, there's her article. Her photo was in the interior in black and white. And so I just kind of reimagined it with her on the front. It's not annotated here because you guys have the rough cut, but this is the before and after is how you can think of counter-narratives. This is also a work in the series. Proud Boys founder Gavin McInnes. If you look at the one on the left, you get a sense of how attached the Times is to kind of celebrating white supremacy. He was a hipster and a far-right firebrand. And you see the image at the top. He is not the guy holding the mic. And I was like, if you're a firebrand, maybe you should be in charge. Maybe you should be holding the mic. So I reimagined it on the side as from Vice Media to gang leader. Really also think about coded language and how that language is applied to particular communities, but I've never heard of a white dude called a gang member. So, and he also said it was a gang, so there you go. And so that's the work that I do. I'm very interested in finding ways for myself and for other people to reimagine and think critically about visual and language and how that defines how we see the world. And I think primarily from a bottom-up perspective, if we can some kind of create a type of literacy or strengthen our skills to see things, that we can kind of combat them a bit more. And just to share a bit more here, these aren't about images. So we're at the 30th anniversary of the Central Park 5 case. And this series, No Humans Involved After Sylvia Winter, looks at 12 days of reporting from the Daily News about the Central Park 5, from the first day's reporting to the infamous Trump ad, where I'm simply just really highlighting dehumanizing and animalistic language. And so this isn't, I've blacked out all of the images. I'm trying to get people to somehow see 5 black boys as a victim, and I felt like they couldn't if we were also looking at a white woman. So I had to kind of really force the eye. So this is, you see Wolfpack's Prey, you also see Savages. There are 20 pages that will be in the Whitney Biennial, and this is kind of me rushing mad dash to finish them. Wilding is probably the second day of reporting. That was the front page. Inside there was another panel that says teen gang rapes jogger, no alleged, no suspected. Wolves hunted as cops combed was one. And I don't think I can see that to read it to you. Okay, yeah. A cop looked in and was surprised to see the kids sleeping. A few of them jerked fitfully in sleep, guilt working hard on the body. The cop was glad to see this. Look, he recalled saying to a detective, humans. This is a moment where we picked the title already, but then we got to that page and we were like, yes, this is the perfect title. So that's my work, and I think, you know, in kind of honor of the thinking about kind of vision and justice, maybe I'll borrow from Richard Pryor a little bit. I was thinking about just us. and trying to create a set of tools for myself and other colored folk kind of to protect ourselves against a lot of this messaging. And I think this kind of segues into Nicole's work.
Thank you.
Sorry.
It's such a great pleasure and joy to be here and to talk to you about the work I've been doing for the past 7+ years on art, visual culture, and mass incarceration. And it ties in very nicely with the setup by Jelani and the work that Alex is doing in terms of thinking about how we see and who we see. And my work has focused largely on our loved ones who are rendered invisible, who have been removed, the many millions of people have been removed from the streets, from our homes, from our communities, and our only way of accessing them is visiting them in prison visiting rooms. And so it started for me when, actually when I turned to a shoebox, and it's a shoebox where I had collected many images of posing with my incarcerated cousins, people I had grown up with. While I was going to college, they were 16, 17, 18, going to prison 10, 20, 30 years, one incarcerated for life, sentenced to life. And I had to come to terms with these images, and I started doing that by just sharing. Whenever people would invite me to lecture, I would just bring these images and start talking about them and talk about growing up in Southwest Ohio in a very hyper-incarcerated community and what it means to pose in prison with incarcerated relatives and to try to maintain family across our prison nation. And from doing that, basically my community has grown. I was invited by Aperture, Michael Femigetti and Brendan, to co-edit a special issue of Aperture magazine on the impact of photography on documenting mass incarceration. And we were able to think about the work of many amazing Black photographers and non-Black photographers who are doing work around exposing the cultural impact of mass incarceration, like the work of Dina Lawson, the work of Sable Elise Smith. I'm going to move through some of these briefly, and also Keith Calhoun and Chandra McCormick, who are a married couple who've been documenting the impact of incarceration on the state of Louisiana and Black Louisianans since the early 80s. Many of their neighbors are in the lower Ninth Ward, have been incarcerated at Angola, and they see their relative, they see part of the documenting work of Angola as maintaining relations with family members who are being held in punitive captivity and their neighbors, and also thinking about the long legacy of racialized captivity and racialized violence and subjugation. And I wanted to set up by showing you some of these images to think about how non-incarcerated people, social agents, people who are committed to social justice, document incarceration and mass incarceration. The focus of my work largely has been on the work of incarcerated people to document their experience. So the book that is coming out with Harvard University Press in a few months is called Marking Time, Art in the Era of Incarceration, and Mass Incarceration. And it features about 6 dozen currently and formerly incarcerated artists who talk about what it means to use their punitive captivity, to use the time to experience time as punishment. We are sitting in this room, and it's such a joy and a delight to be here, and thank you, Sarah Lewis, for putting this together. We don't know what it means to have our time measured as punishment. And so I think about how incarcerated people are documenting this, and one of the ways of doing that is thinking about the spaces where they're making art. This is a self-portrait by a formerly incarcerated artist, Ronnie Goodman, who's painting himself into a long legacy of self-portraits by artists. But there are certain symbols that show that he is held in punitive captivity. The blues of his uniform, he's in San Quentin. The prison guard's window up above where he can be watched, but he can't see them. These are other drawings by incarcerated people. This is an artist named Cornell Honeycutt, held in Supermax. And so he's documenting the place where he's held 23 hours a day, sends it out to the Solitary Watch program, and they make it available on their website. In terms of thinking about time, many incarcerated people actually make art that's reflecting on punitive time. And this is a really amazing painter by Raymond Taylor, who was wrongfully convicted, held in prison for 27 years. And during that time, he said he studied the so-called great masters. And so he got really into Salvador Dali, and this is his passing time painting. Then Eddie Cates. Eddie Cates is in prison now in New Jersey. He's in his 60s. His family have been trying to get him out. They suspect wrongful conviction. 27 years into his his sentence, he starts to take a drawing class. And this is one of his very first drawings based on an archival photograph. Many incarcerated people all they have are pencils and paper. And so there's a lot of graphite drawing. Here's his interpretation of the killing of Philando Castile called Deja Vu. Again, he's 62, 63, first-time artist. And then Kenneth Reams, who's also currently incarcerated. He's in a Supermax prison. He's on death row. And he's thinking about what's available to incarcerated people, the kind of junk, the kind of poison, but also the continued impoverishment of the families of incarcerated people. So you put money on the books so your incarcerated loved ones can buy junk, and how it fuels the type of system. I'm just going to go through some of the images, and I'm happy for us to just talk more about it. James Hoff is another incarcerated artist who's reflecting very much thinking about punitive captivity. He's a juvenile lifer. He was sentenced to life without parole at the age of 17. A sentence that, thanks to Brian Stevenson and his arguing before the Supreme Court, is now considered unconstitutional. But many people like James Hoff are still held in prison. He hasn't been released. He's become a mentor to other incarcerated artists, teaching them how to make art since over his 30 plus years in prison. One of my favorites, Tamika Cole. She was brutalized by prison guards and could not do anything about her being brutalized except for making art. And she said in making this portrait of herself, she created her own dark calm. Mm-hmm. She, like many incarcerated artists, also are thinking about racialized violence on the streets and how the prison extends beyond buildings. This is her work connected to the Black Lives Matter movement, but thinking about the racialized killing. It's called Black Lives Splattered. One of the things that I focus on is how incarcerated artists gather material, how they create color with limited access to materials. So Jared Owens, for example, wanted to become an abstract painter. He said the only way he could manage penal time was to turn it into an abstraction. So he spent 18 years in prison, federal prison, for nonviolent drug offenses, became this really accomplished painter. This is his triptych, where he takes the iconic brick slave ship that Dr. Cheryl Finley has written about so eloquently and maps over it the prison where he's incarcerated. He lines up the holding cells, and then the dark spots you see is dirt that he took from the prison yard and incorporated into his painting. An incredible formerly incarcerated artist, Mary Baxter, has created this video triptych talking about giving birth in prison, where she was shackled for 43 hours. The title, Ain't I a Woman?, connecting again to the long history of Black captivity and also Black feminist activism. And then I want to end on portraiture. So probably the most common genre of art making in prison is portraiture. And I love being able to put their portraits in conversation with the amazing work of like Kehinde Wiley, his mugshot series, which inspired many of his future portraits, or Titus Kaphar, whose wonderful project, the Jerome Project, grew out of his search for his incarcerated father in prison databases and realizing that there were numerous men who shared the name of his father. People inside prison are also doing this kind of portraiture work where they're thinking about the relationship between Black subjectivity, Black individuality, and the history of criminal indexes and how portraits have been used by prisons to mark people. So here's Ronnie Goodman's self-portrait with boots. He's very inspired by Van Gogh. It's a lithograph. George Anthony Morton, who's become a really accomplished portrait artist who started in prison. This is his work, Mars. Brian Harrington, currently incarcerated. He was sentenced to 27 years at age 14. There's a clemency petition going around. Please sign it. He's right now at Dixon in Illinois, and we're hoping to get him out. Again, James Hoff. James Hoff was very inspired by Shepard Fairey, the Hope poster of Obama. And so here is his self-portrait, portrait of Yaya. I was lost, art broke all my chains. And then I want to end with one of my favorite artists and friends, Russell Craig, who at age 5 entered the foster care system and was tethered to foster care and prisons until he's in his early 30s. And he uses his criminal index, he uses his prison ID card to turn it into this great work of art, where he says, I found art in the Department of Corrections. He was also making portraits of his other incarcerated relatives while he's in prison. So while he's in state prison, his sister is in federal prison, and here's a portrait of her. Since being released, he's gone on to think about the criminalization of Black people, and here's his piece, Locks, when the Supreme Court rules that it's fine to discriminate against people wearing dreadlocks. And then I want to end with one of his most well-known pieces. This is an 8-foot portrait, self-portrait that he's done on his own prison records. So once he got out of prison, he collected all of his records to create this great work of art, self-portrait. Thank you.
Do you need this? Do you need this?
So Nicole, I thought maybe we could come back to some of your ideas and something that you've written about and discussed, the idea that this type of work, looking at the work of prisoners, looking at other types of icons that you've explored in your scholarship, thinking about racial discourse as a social force. Maybe you could explore that idea a little bit for us.
So thank you, and I want to just jump off to continue with what Suspit said about collecting. So one of the things that I learned through working on this project, and I'm going to get to this question, is that we can also shift how we think about collecting. Guess who collects prison art? Incarcerated people. To think about incarcerated people as collectors of art. You know, it changes some of the kind of the hierarchies that we create around who has access to art, who owns art, and what art is of value. So, and I think that does connect with the issues of icon and iconic, right? So I was interested in thinking about what does it mean to have an aesthetic vision? We're talking about justice and vision from a site of punitive captivity, where you have very little political rights and almost no social value. What does it mean to have a vision when you're in a 6-foot by 9-foot cell? When maybe you're spending 22 years in solitary confinement. And so these are some of the issues that I explore, and I can only explore it by being in conversation with people who have been written out of many art histories, and those are people who are in prison. And I think in terms of us rethinking about what does the icon mean in this current moment, it's for us to really be more capacious in terms of thinking about who we're in conversation with and who's contributing to culture.
Alex, you're really putting your own work out there as that's a form of an icon and encouraging a kind of conversation in the public sphere.
Yeah, I mean, it's a appropriation, it's a counter narrative, it's, in terms of the last series, it's literally kind of a highlight. I think one of the things I learned, I sometimes teach the work when I'm invited to talk to young students, and they're always really hesitant. So they're like, but it's already been written, and it's been published, and it's been circulated. And that solidifies something for them, right? And I didn't understand that until I said, okay, mark it up. And they all pause, and then they're like, but it's already done. It is what it is. And I'm like, it's kind of not, though. Have you ever read this article? And they're like, no. And I'm like, well, write on it and tell me what you think. And then everybody's like feverishly, I think that visual arts, particularly visual arts that combats things that we see opens a door for us to challenge what was written, what was kind of already put down as fact, you know. I think a lot of us naturally maybe rail against institutions, particularly like the New York Times, but inherently I think we also believe them, right? And so it's just a reminder as we kind of go through the day. Like I got my New York Times today and I was like, oh, is this a personal touch? But then there is kind of this, the work of visual arts is to kind of introduce alternatives, to introduce new ways of thinking. So yeah.
Makeda, can I join in just because part of what Alex's work does is also challenge the public. I mean, she puts the work in the public, and I think giving access to like people going to the subway to that kind of work is so powerful. That's part of.
I think so. I think that, Jelani, just to bring you in the conversation, it seems like your own work is also about challenging the public to think differently about institutions and representation. Even though you're not dealing with visual arts, you're still talking about issues of representation and challenging the public conception of who is represented in civic institutions, who is teaching what, who is representing what kind of information.
Yeah, and there's a one-to-one connection to that, which is that I recently guest edited an issue of the Columbia Journalism Review, and Alexandra's work on Michael Brown is on the cover of it. And that issue was specifically around who is not in newsrooms and what conversations are not had in newsrooms, and the way that, you know, the dynamics that lead to these conversations being had in such a way that they think that this is an appropriate way of discussing something that is really a matter of someone's life. And it confounds the convenient ideas about this. So one of the kind of most notorious statements about Michael Brown was the article that began with, "He was not an angel," but a black journalist wrote that line.
Yep.
And I wound up in a heated exchange with an editor at the New York Times after they ran the Nazi Next Door piece. And they didn't really understand why that was wrong. Dean Baquet is the editor-in-chief.
Yeah.
And so these conversations become complicated in these ways because sometimes simply diversifying the institution doesn't change the way the institution functions.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And so when we saw Alexandra's work, we were like, that's exactly what we're trying to get at here. And the things that I'm talking about, anytime that you see something that I've written, especially on subjects like this, that is the one that made the cut out of like the 10 or 12 other things that week that could have been on the list.
Yeah.
And so it's that same sort of dynamic.
Yeah. Can I jump in there? It's funny that you should mention that because I had just actually left the Times. I went to speak to a kind of a small group of editors, and we walked through the works, and there were a room full of black and brown folk, you know. I don't make the diversity argument when people ask me if we can fix things. I'm usually like, burn it down. There is this kind of assumption that we'll put kind of, my work deals with frameworks. I'm not interested in the authors really. There are several hands that go into that kind of output, right? There's a headline editor and a photo editor and a layout manager and so many different people that combined still produce the same damaging content, right? And so there's always this assumption if you get a black person to cover a story, you won't get "He was no angel." You'll get something else. I don't know, right?
Can I add one quick thing to that? It's like, in some ways it's wrong, like the diversity argument is wrong on its face anyway. Because what it says is, we're going to behave in these racist ways, and then we'll hire people of color who have to stick their necks out and deal with all the flack, and then deal with the political consequences of this, and then they leave after 2 months, and we're going like, well, we tried.
Well, they were there anyway as kind of like, as part of a temporary kind of fellowship anyway, right? There's not a real position. Yeah, absolutely.
Fix. And so like, I have students at Columbia who ask me, and I was shocked the first time I got this, but now I've gotten this question, and no exaggeration, I've probably gotten this question 50 times from white students who ask me if it's okay for them to write stories about people of color and racism. And I was like, no, you absolutely have to write these stories. You need to take my class, go through all of this kind of history of media representations and all these other kinds of things. But we really need for people to not simply be saying, stick the person of color in this position. And then on the other side, you have places where you have a room full of people who do something like the Ancestry.com commercial. And they think that that's cool.
I want to believe there was just like one black person in there that was like, I'm just going to let the rock down. That was tired. They were like, you know what, not today. They're
Not
just
today. But no, I think that's good. You should go ahead.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that tying a lot of your work is, all three of you, is this interest in material culture in the public sphere and actually thinking about how these objects that come to us, either by a screen or other aspects, that these messages are important in shaping our racial understanding.
Yeah.
Any last
And I think it's also ties in the work of a lot of black artists and cultural critics to take, racist, anti-black media materiality and to turn it into something else, to transcode it into other meaning. And I mean, this is clearly what Alex is doing with the counter-narrative series, and it happens also among incarcerated artists. They often take their own their sentencing papers. They take their disciplinary records, and they turn them they appropriate them and create art out of it. So I think this is a long history of working with anti-black material and mining that for other stories.
Yeah.
We're just about out of time. Thank you so much, Nicole, Jelani, and Alex. Thank you.
Thank you.